Good evening, everyone. I'm Nayaswami Asha, and we're continuing our study of the essence of self-realization, the wisdom of Paramhansa Yogananda. We're up to chapter 16, which is now called Ways in Which God Can Be Worshipped. I wanted to clarify this is my note so that I don't forget. I wanted to clarify one thing that I said at the very end of the last webinar. Somebody brought in a question, and the question was about reading the teachings of other masters rather than just our own guru. And I did comment and say that I have to be honest that I myself have not only just read Swami and Master's books, but when I think I made this clear, but I really do want to make it clear. Ever since I came to Swamiji, I've never gone to anyone else for teaching because nobody else's teaching explained it to me to my own heart and my own mind with the same power and satisfaction. I've read many, many biographies and stories of the lives of saints because I'm very inspired by how other people have dedicated themselves. So I've read biographies biographies, autobiographies, but in fact, whenever those biographies drift into teaching, I tend to lose interest and I skip until I'm back into the story. But for 40 years I've been doing that, and I'm always eager to find another saint and another teaching. I have to say, and I think I mentioned it last week, Master said, though, among Catholic saints, he was just speaking, only read about those who are in our line, is how he put it, because you don't want to get an image in your mind of an expression of spirituality that's too far away from the one that we're following, because it confuses you. It's just as simple as that. I went into the issue at great length last week, so I don't need to go more, but I did want to just make that little point clear. Okay, now, this is a fabulous chapter, no surprise. Every chapter of this book is fabulous. For some reason, reading through this one, this is what I've actually commented about, and I think I mentioned it last week too. I've read this book many, many times. And this time reading this particular chapter, it was somehow like I just understood things I hadn't understood before. There's always a deeper level that we can go to. Either we have a moment of receptivity, or our own consciousness is shifted in some fundamental way. We've had some experiences that make a particular aspect of the teaching suddenly vivid because it's no longer an abstraction. Whatever the cause, I really loved this chapter. So let me see if I can share some of you share with some of you so much of what I loved. I'll just start and just turn the pages this time. The first section here is about the concept of self-realization, and if self is the goal, where does the concept of worship come in? I'm amused by this because our temple, it's called the Ananda Church of Self-Realization, that's the name that's on the front of it, here in Palo Alto is on a very public street. And many of you know that Palo Alto is a big tech center, and there's a lot of self-declared important people who wander around in this area, and some of them are actually quite creative and quite influential and really quite wonderful. I love this area. Well, somebody came here to go to Stanford for something or some business conference, and he was talking about wacky California. I don't know what part of the country he was from, but he took a picture of our church as one of the examples of wacky California, because it's a church that's devoted to worshiping the people who are in it, as far as he could describe it, because it's a church about self. We were just so amused. We were delighted to be noticed. It's one of those, we don't care what you say about us as long as you're talking about us. Was that the mayor of New York who made that statement? But of course, he just displayed his own ignorance. But nonetheless, it was amusing. But Yogananda answers the question, and it's a question worth asking. And he says, worship means to seek identity with the object of one's concentration. That's what it is to worship, is to make it the center of your reality and to want to merge yourself into that. You're worshiping God, you're worshiping Jesus, And of course, the self that we're worshiping, and we make a big point of putting a capital S on it, it's your higher self. And it's a very important concept, though, because, and we do discuss this in this chapter, this balance between this awareness that this is our own nature and the necessity not to confuse that higher self with the ego self. And then Master talks about something that I've given a lot of thought to myself, for some reason, because a lot of new thought people are so committed to affirmations. And even though Master himself taught the power of positive thinking and wrote affirmations, and Swami Kriyananda wrote affirmations, there's a certain way that people embrace affirmations that does not seem as efficacious as it might be. And so Master touches on it first by saying, at the beginning, it's a difficult concept for the human mind to grasp, is how he puts it. One may affirm, I am infinite, and this is the key. But without humility and devotion, one slips much too easily into ego consciousness. And somehow I see people sometimes, if they're too dedicated to affirming these high states of consciousness without sufficient devotion to God, then they just seem to go in circles. I'm not going to say that they become egotistical, but they don't transform, because the constant affirmation that I am this, I am that, I am wealthy, I am infinite, I am free, I am perfect, without first redefining the I, and that the subconscious doesn't really quite know what to do with it. Because most of us, all of us really, when on a deeper level, when we're asked, who am I? We can offer the philosophical answer. I am one with the infinite. I am a divine child. But, well, in the story of Corrie ten Boom, who was a Christian woman who helped the Jews in Amsterdam when the Nazis invaded in the Second World War, and Jews were hidden in her house. And they had a secret room, the hiding place. That's the name of the book she wrote. And as part of the training, so in case they were busted by the Gestapo, which eventually they were, that her nephew would burst into her room in the middle of the night, wake her from a dead sleep, shine a flashlight in her face, and start screaming at her, where are the Jews? Where are the Jews? She needed to come out of deep subconsciousness and have the right answer just like that. And she tended to come out of deep subconsciousness and say, in the secret room on the other side of this wall. And she had a particular difficulty. I guess she said she slept really deeply. And it was very hard for her to train her subconscious to immediately answer, there's no Jews in this house. But she, of course, gradually learned to do it. So most of us, if we're woken from a deep sleep, so to speak, and asked, who are you? What is your name? We just say, I'm Asha Praver, I live in Palo Alto. We don't wake from a deep sleep and say, I am one with the infinite. Now, that's, of course, exactly what we're trying to do. But until that self-definition is spontaneous, and that the I no longer applies to the ego, to the infinite, to the jiva identified with its limited physical form, we have to be careful what we affirm with that pronoun I, because the subconscious gets really confused. And so, humility and devotion. Now, Master himself gave us affirmations, but he wrote them in a certain way, with a certain flow, and taught us to work with one for a long, long time, rather than just piling one upon the other, because humility and devotion. He said also it's just simply more natural for us to think of the divine as separate from ourselves. Even though philosophically and intellectually we can analyze it out, it's more natural. And in a complete other context, Swamiji defined what it is to be a yogi. What it is to be a yogi is to recognize the reality that we're living in and to work with it, to follow a specific method that will move us from where we are now to where we're trying to go. And that's what he described as being a yogi. And he was also making the distinction between what it is to be a yogi versus what the path of pure jnana, because in the Bhagavad Gita, that's where this is. Krishna says, the path of jnana is very difficult to follow in this age. Better to be a yogi. And what the explanation that Swami gave to that, Master's explanation, is that a jnani just denies reality altogether. And Master mentions that here, the jnanic practice of neti, neti, not this, not this. But the pure jnani denies this universe, simply declares that it doesn't exist. And as Master said, that's a very hard path to follow, because we're experiencing it all the time. We're constantly experiencing our apparent separateness. And so a yogi, Master explains, is someone who takes the reality that we're in and works with it to lift us into a higher reality. And so devotion to God as an idea, as an ideal of this benign omnipresence that is always there loving and caring for us is a plausible fiction. It works, because that is what we actually experience. And at the point that we are no longer experiencing it, then that's the point when self-realization comes in. But we get there faster by working with what is natural to us. Master also just deals a little bit with the objections that people raise about worship for God. This is a very important chapter, this whole chapter, this whole concept in this book. Lately I've been, the actual only word I can use is I've become impatient. I've become impatient with this desperate effort to try to be a spiritual person without having humility and devotion to God. And just working so hard to make the ego all by itself enough. And somehow just thinking we can trick this necessity for humility and devotion. And I have yet to see it be anything other than a strong effort to avoid humility and devotion. I'm willing to be corrected on that point, but I have had trouble seeing it. Now, devotion, bear in mind, just engaging the love of the heart. But devotion and humility save us from making serious mistakes and getting ourselves into cul-de-sacs of dryness and disappointment that our spiritual efforts are not taking us where we need to go. We need to be in relationship to a higher power that can really infuse us with a consciousness that the ego simply can't bring to the table. As they say, the ego itself is already corrupted with the very delusion that we're trying to overcome. So we can't just keep organizing it in such a way that it will annihilate itself. It won't do that. It needs to be, we need to be infused. We need to understand with humility and devotion that there is this reality that exists, and it's effective. It works. We get what we really want, which is joy and fulfillment, by following that path. There's one of the sections in here, this New Thought person, as he's described, a student of New Thought, just talked about, he says he has trouble visualizing God, and cosmic ground of being is such an abstraction. Swamiji would always use that as the example. It's hard to have devotion for a cosmic ground of being. It's hard to love and have an intimate relationship with a cosmic ground of being. And this New Thought person says that he's having trouble with those concepts, because then he says to Master, your relationship with the Lord is so loving. How can I have a relationship like that? And that's just such a simple childlike acceptance of what it is that we really want, isn't it? I mean, yes, we have to respect the intellectual side of things. And Master talks here about, some people are most inspired by the image of infinite light. It's not that you have to take the anthropomorphic point of view necessarily, But there has to be something that thrills the heart and that puts you into some intimacy, or else the transformation doesn't happen. And that is the whole point, isn't it? To have the transformation. So Master is answering also some of the questions that people ask. How can God have form and also be formless? How can he be the infinite totality of everything and also be the Divine Mother or the Heavenly Father? Master gives such a concrete example. Swamiji often said that, every idea, no matter how abstract or how broad in its scope, it needs to be able to be brought down to a very simple, accessible explanation. And Swamiji said the great fun for him of writing especially was when he could bring things down like this. And he, of course, learned from Master. Master gives the example of steam, water, and ice. Steam, water, and ice are all the same substance, but steam is utterly without form. Water is more perceivable, but then water freezes into ice. And once it freezes into ice, as Master says, it can be shaped into any form at all. You can turn ice into, they have these marvelous ice sculpture contests. You can make a castle, you can make a king, you can make a jet airplane. It's all just ice, and now it can be formed. The water can't be formed, and the steam is escaping in all directions. Master says, so it is with God. He appears to us, he says, by the power of our devotion, we can draw the steam into the form of ice, into whatever form it is that the power of our devotion has, it solidifies. It brings the abstraction of God into that which our heart longs for. And it's all true. The steam, the water, and the ice are all the same reality. And so God just assumes these many forms. And in the same way, one of Master's visitors spoke of the question of, if God is so infinite, how can he also be responsive to our prayers? And Master says, you're too finite in your concept of infinite. That was the way he put it, jokingly, is the way Swami took the note down. Because if you can be infinite, as Master put it so simply, that means you're also infinitesimal. You're everywhere. And infinitesimal to the point of knowing the finest nuance of feeling of any devotee. And that's the mystery, as Master says in other places, of omnipresence. That it's so hard for the mind to get around it. I was meditating on it today, just trying to feel that the distance and the intimacy simultaneously, the infinite power and the compassionate tenderness all at the same time. The mind just can't go there. And this is, again, now the next point that Swami explains here, that Master said. A student of comparative religions said that every religion defines God differently. And the student says, it makes me wonder if the founders of those religions really knew what they were talking about. So then Master starts explaining that, definitions of God really have nothing to do with who he is. That you can't just bring it down to something like that, that what we're really looking for is not perfect definitions, but the experience. And he was saying that when a master comes, because this is his consciousness, and he knows that he can't bring that consciousness down to something that the intellect can grasp in words. Swami Vivekananda was said to have answered the question when someone asked him, why did God create the universe? And Vivekananda answered, the level of consciousness that asks the question is not capable of understanding the answer. And in other words, you have to experience it. You can't just think about it. So intellectual scholars think that religion is about saying it just exactly right. But the masters who live in the consciousness of this infinity realize that there's no way to put that infinity into an intellectual mind. So as Master says it so perfectly, what the masters try to do with their descriptions, their definitions, their explanations, they try to inspire people to want to commune with the reality that they're describing. You know, this is how the way a master even communicates becomes quite different than the way ordinary people communicate. And sometimes there's people start trying to parse apart the difference between truth and fact. Here's an example. Master asked that a certain room in his ashram be painted. And he'd asked the devotee to paint it, and the man hadn't even had time, as he said himself, to buy the paint. But to Master, because time itself was an illusion, he knew it would be painted. He had asked that he be painted, and he looked at the room and he said, "Isn't it beautiful?" And he painted it all himself. And Master said this to his disciple Rajasi. And Rajasi looked at the room, which clearly hadn't been painted in a very long time, and looked at the man who was supposed to have painted it, and they just smiled at each other and just admired what Master was seeing. Master saw the truth that time is an illusion and the room would be painted. So now it is painted as much as it will be, because there is no will be. But the facts were also that the man hadn't even bought the paint. But the Master wasn't lying. He was just looking at the world from a completely different level. And so when the Masters are talking to us about God, they're really talking to us about the truth of God. They're not talking to us about the facts of God, because facts exist on the level of reason and intellect. Truth is the overarching power behind it. So the Master will speak to us in whatever way he feels will draw us into that. And this is this particular interesting chapter, which I've actually been wondering about lately. Thus, if sometimes the Master compares God to drinking wine or the pleasures of human love, it's not really because he wants people to drink wine or the pleasures of human love, or as if those things actually bear any relationship to the infinite. But he says it's because people already find pleasure in those things. And if you say to them, what the pleasure that you're feeling now really is just the tiniest sliver of what it is that you can really have, in this way the Master accomplishes the truth of what he's trying to do, which is to inspire people to seek that experience. And that's all that he's doing. The scholar considers it an end in itself if he can write it out just exactly so. Master doesn't care. He wants the devotees to be transformed in the light. That's the only truth that matters to him. The Master then was starting to talk about the question also that people raise about Hinduism and the many different gods, so to speak, that exist in Hinduism. Master was talking about, and this is a very important point for us to understand, because often in our Western intellectuality, it's not as bad as it used to be when Master was talking in the 40s and the early 50s, when these things were so unknown, and the whole mystery of India was not explored so easily and readily the way it is now, that the world has become so accessible and so unified in so many ways, that there was always this idea of the Hindu gods. For some reason, even in my own childhood, that was always the image that the Hindus had all these gods, and it was just such an anathema in the West. I grew up Jewish, where you don't even have any pictures or anything, so the whole idea of the Hindu gods, we in our embarrasses me now, but in our ignorance we just dismissed it. Whereas in fact what is being expressed through that is so much more subtle than we really understand. The way Master describes it is he's saying here that it's very hard to talk about what God is. So the concept of all the gods is an expression of what God does, which is, in other words, how we experience the divine force in our lives. And we experience the divine in so many different ways. For example, there's the Hindu trinity of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, which is considered the creator, the preserver, and the destroyer. And Swamiji has written at length about this in other places. And the idea is very simply that we experience in our human life, don't we? We experience that these different things happen. There are periods of time of creation when we're perhaps starting an enterprise or early in our life, or have given birth to a child and are raising that child. We're creating a family, is what people actually say. And then there's also a phase where everything is more or less in place and we just have to keep it going. We're not creating new realities. We're not innovating. We're not at the cutting edge of things that have never been done before. We're just preserving what's going along. And then there's a time always when everything dissolves, whether it's death that takes it away or unexpected change, but nothing ever stays the same. We can't keep it preserved forever. It always eventually turns into something else. Swamiji, one of the early aphorisms I remember of his was, the only certainty in life is change. Most people do not like change. Therefore, most people are unhappy. Just that little trio of statements, and it struck me so powerfully. I've never forgotten it. I must have read that in 1969. Because I was at that time also extremely interested in how and why people made themselves unhappy so continuously. And Swami just stated it right there. People want things to stay the same. So in the Hindu mythology, so to speak, in the pantheon of divine figures, they have the god of creation, Brahma. We have the god of preservation, Vishnu. And then we have the god who destroys, Shiva. And all of those come from God. All of those are aspects of how the divine works in this world. And see, we get ourselves set, and we just primarily want Vishnu. Once we get what we want just Vishnu. We want him just to preserve it. We want our children to stay small and adorable. We want everybody that we love to just stay right where they're going to stay. We don't want our son to fall in love with someone in a foreign country and move 10,000 miles away. We want Vishnu to just hold things the way they are. But that's not the way it happens, is it? All three of these aspects are always there. And when you begin to appreciate from studying the gods all these different dimensions of the way the divine expresses in your life, then you realize, the phrase I was going to say is multidimensional, the infinite is. That sounds silly, but you understand what I mean, that there's times when really Shiva is the god that you need to focus on, either because something is being taken away from you, or because we ourselves are needing to change. And we want our ignorance to be destroyed, or our attachments to be destroyed. And there are other times when we are needing the power of inspiration to create. And Brahma, then, is that aspect of the infinite that we concentrate on. And Master goes at great length here to describe the goddess Kali, who is one of the most exotic, and to the Western mind, I would almost use the word bizarre, expressions of the divine. Kali has this wild black hair, and she has a garland of skulls around her neck, and she has 4 hands, and one of them has a sword, and one of them is holding a severed head, and one of them is offering out a boon, a blessing like this, and she's dancing wildly. And I was in India on one of the trips that we took. For over a period of 20 years, every year or so, we took a group of Americans to India, and we'd travel through the places that were sacred to Autobiography of a Yogi, in the footsteps of Paramhansa Yogananda. It was a great experience. Every single time we did it, it was fabulous. Eventually, when Ananda started its own work in India, we surrendered all of that to others who were on location there, and it was time for us to look in new ways. But we were often in India during the Kali Puja, Durga Puja season, 9 days of worship services devoted, depending on where you were in India, to which god, which form of the goddess there. And so we were often in Calcutta. In this particular year, we were in Calcutta, and Kali Puja was being celebrated. It's very wonderful traditions in that country, just wonderful traditions. And during Kali Puja, all the different neighborhoods would get together and they would just build out an altar, and they would have some marvelous statue of Kali commissioned with all of her remarkable attributes, lavishly illustrated by these very artistic images. And they would just sort of be in the corner of a street or in somebody's front yard or something like that. And we were walking through the streets, a neighborhood in Calcutta, perhaps near Master's house at 4 Garpar Road, I'm not exactly sure. And it was very crowded because it was the festival season. And our own group was 30-some people, and there were also many others on the street. And every few blocks you would come to one of these altar areas with the Kali statue, and something was happening, and we were on the street together and we were looking in another direction. And the crowd kept pushing and we kept being pushed back. And gradually I was backing up without really being conscious of what was behind me. And after a time, I suddenly turned and I was right next to a Kali statue. I mean, I was practically, in her lap. And there was the garland of skulls and her red tongue lolling out, the whole schmear. The whole thing was there. And I was earlier in my travels to India at that time, and I was still learning and trying to understand the culture. And seeing one after another of these Kali statues, I just couldn't quite get my mind around it. And suddenly I find myself just pushed right into her aura. And I sort of just looked at her and I said, "What are you anyway?" I didn't say it out loud, but that's what it was. "Why are you in my face like this?" And then I looked at it and I thought about some of what Master has written here that I had read but not yet understood. But then sort of just looking at her, cutting off our heads with one hand, holding the severed head like this, offering a boon with the other hand, it just occurred to me, life is like that, isn't it? It just, you see, it wasn't an abstraction. It was an experience. I've experienced this. I've experienced all the different ways that life just takes you, that God takes us. And He takes us through so many different things, cutting off our head with one hand and blessing us with the other, even in the same motion. And I appreciated the Kali was a superconscious symbol, is the only way I can think to say it. That some great sage had a vision of the forces that we experience, the way God acts in this world, the way the divine expresses in this world. And He personified that in Kali, and it's a symbol. And we can analyze that symbol, as Master does in here, explaining what all the different things mean, but we can also go right into the symbol and just feel it, which is what the gift that she gave me in that moment, when she essentially just drew me right into her lap and then told me who she was. I don't want to exaggerate it. I didn't go into superconsciousness, but there was a flash of intuition that helped me exactly what Master is saying. The purpose of the divine teachers is to inspire us to commune, not to give us the capacity to lecture brilliantly, but to inspire us to want to understand. And that's exactly what I was drawn into. In this way, the idea of a superconscious symbol, part of the reason that I could understand that is the symbol of Ananda, which all of you have seen. It appears in various places at the front of this video with the mountain and the soaring arcs descending again in the form of the bird. For those of you who've seen the Finding Happiness movie, and if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to find it on the internet and watch it. The symbol is presented and explained. That movie is about a movie about the Ananda communities. Swamiji, several decades ago, the 80s, maybe even in the late 70s, he felt that Ananda needed a symbol, and he wanted it to be something unique. He didn't want to just adopt a symbol that already existed. He wanted it to be unique for Ananda. He wanted it to be simple. He wanted it to communicate the essence of what Ananda is. Ananda is self-realization. Ananda is joyous self-offering. Ananda is joyous service to the world. Ananda is freedom. Those aspects of Ananda, not 9 communities around the world and all the books we publish, but the spirit of it. And he prayed to Master to show him a symbol. And Swamiji, as he said, he saw it. He saw it in meditation. He didn't think it out, he saw it. And then he said it took him about 80 tries before he could draw it accurately. And if you look at it, the lines are thick and thin, the curves are in a certain way, and so on. And later, when he looked at it, he saw the symbols. He saw the mountain of aspiration, where the devotee must go. He saw the soaring arc upward into spirit, and then looping back down again in service to humanity. And of course, the bird represents freedom. But Swamiji didn't create it, he saw it. It was a revelation. And then he communicated what he'd seen. So when I was looking at that Kali statue, because everything that comes down into human life requires human instruments, whether it's an avatar or a highly evolved soul who has a perception and that perception is shared, I realized that some great sage somewhere saw Mother Kali. And then he created it. And then we, all of us, are the beneficiaries of his revelation. Just as we are the beneficiaries of Swami's revelation of that symbol. It's interesting because it is unique, and we wear it as jewelry and in other ways. And very often, when you're wearing that jewelry, someone who knows nothing about what it stands for will just say, "That's so beautiful." I've had that happen to me so many times. People would just say, "That's so beautiful," because they feel it. They don't know what they're feeling or why. They just see it, and the superconscious dimension of it communicates. You know, the cross is a superconscious symbol, the 6-pointed Star of David. Is it 6? Yes, 6-pointed Star of David is a superconscious symbol. They have inherent power. Religions adapt them, but the power is inherent. It's not given to it by the religion. The symbol already has the power, and then the religion will adapt it. So let me go on and see what's here. When Master was, I'm now talking again about the new thought student who wanted to have a more loving relationship with God. Master's trying to explain to us, just as creation, preservation, destruction, the contradictory complexity of Kali is inherent in our experience. Master is trying to explain to us that the loving relationship we have with God is inherent in human life. We just don't recognize it for what it is. And I loved this paragraph. I wanted to read it. He says, first he says, the infinite, the infinite mother is the mother behind all human mothers, and the true father behind all human fathers. He is the ever loyal friend behind all earthly friends. He is the eternal beloved behind all human loves. He is all things to all men, because God is everything. And then he says, through your parents, he cares for you, supports you, and protects you. Through your friends, he shows you that love is a free sharing without any hint of compulsion. Through the beloved, he helps one to find the selfless intensity of divine love. Through people's children, he helps them to understand love as something precious, as a thing to be protected from harmful influences and nourished with devotion. Isn't that beautiful? And Master's trying to help us. Let me take it this way. Swamiji said once something that's extremely intriguing. Everything in the material world, he said, is a symbol of more subtle realms of reality, and is not an end in itself, but is a symbol that is meant to help us gradually expand our consciousness until we can embrace that greater reality. That the ego, because it identifies with the material world so deeply, again, these are these subconscious habits that we carry. We tend to think of the material world being the defining reality. And we're always trying to bring God into this world. God, of course, wants us to be happy. We say God wants us all to be nice with each other. God doesn't want us to tear down the rainforest. We take the world that we want, and then we try to say that this is what God wants for us. But the truth of it is that everything that happens here is a symbol of a more subtle realm. And the only purpose of this material world is not to find perfection here or to ever get it finely organized. It's not intended for that. It's for us to experience the greater reality behind it. And depending on what yuga we're in, and we're in an ascending yuga, but very early, conditions here will be a mixture of light and dark. And no amount of egoic determination that it should be another way and God wants it this way is going to make it that way. It just won't happen. And this is where humility and devotion are required. And so through this, Master is telling us exactly how we can find the divine in all of these situations. I love how he says, through the beloved, God helps us to find the selfless intensity of divine love. You see, God is behind all of this. He's not he's not denying our experience. That's what I want to say. He's not rejecting our experience. He's not saying you're wrong to feel that way. He's just saying exactly what Master was saying earlier in this book. He's drawing us into a deeper reality by starting with what we already know and what we already love, the selfless intensity of romantic love. He's trying to show us, isn't this wonderful? But this is just a sliver of what you can really have. And so we begin to understand that much, and then the heart is not fulfilled. Even when you have the most perfect of these experiences, the soul knows there's more. And we're led there, step by step. Here's how he put it. It isn't that God wants you to deny your human nature. What he wants, rather, is for you to purify it, to expand whatever love you feel in your heart, and not to keep it locked up in ego attachments. So by all of these experiences which are natural to us, we find our greater and greater capacity to love. As Swamiji put it once, the intensity of these love relationships are given to us so that we will begin to understand our own capabilities. And we'll begin to understand the joy of beginning to expand into those capabilities. And that's why also, if we become too defined by the form that love has taken, then Shiva comes in, takes those forms away, because that's not the point. And when we in our ego, upset, exclaim that this isn't what was supposed to happen, no, this is exactly what's supposed to happen, because humility and devotion are also required. Okay. I have one question, and I think I'll stop for a moment and just take it now, and then go on with the rest of the chapter.
How much should we be in the world and participating on this plane as opposed to actively pursuing meditation and spiritual life? How do you find the balance?
Well, first of all, it's not as opposed to. There is no as opposed to. Spiritual life is life. That's all there is to it. And our karma brings us into certain circumstances, and it's through those karmic conditions that we're able to learn. This idea that these are opposites does not serve us spiritually. What serves us spiritually is to realize that Absolutely everything that comes to us is given to us by God and is the same opportunity to serve Him and to experience His presence. You know, the last section here is actually extremely relevant to that. Of course, meditation is the supportive practice that makes it possible for us to be aware of God's presence. It's very difficult to be aware of God's presence behind the material world if we never go inward enough to feel that presence and to bring that consciousness into everything that we're doing. But many people spend a lot of time just being conflicted or being intellectual and wanting some kind of intellectual answer. How much do I do this? How much do I do that? Our karma brings us into a relationship. We have parents, we have children, we have creative work that we need to do. This world requires us to earn money. Is all of that happening outside of the will of God? Is none of that, is there nothing in that that we can learn and give? Now let me just say, let me go where I want to go. The 12th entry of the 13 in this chapter is Master speaks of the 8 aspects of God. There are 8 aspects in which God can be experienced, he says: light, sound, peace, calmness, love, joy, wisdom, and power. Now, the 8 manifestations of God, the 8 aspects of God, as he's calling them here, have proven for me to be, for me, over the course of these decades, one of the most useful spiritual ideas that I have. And it's exactly related to what this question is about. Because we hear this idea that we're supposed to be a channel for God, we're supposed to be an instrument of God, we're supposed to manifest God's presence, and here I'm saying, well, you should be a channel for God in whatever you're doing. You know, I never exactly repeated the question, but the question was, how much time do we spend in ordinary pursuits of life as opposed to the spiritual pursuits and meditation? And I started by saying there is no as opposed to. We are, at all times, we are equally in the presence of God. We are equally capable of being in a state of full superconscious self-realization. If God is everything, when would we not be in that position? Of course, some things are more God-reminding and therefore facilitate our smriti, which is the awakening within us of this divine memory. And so therefore one should spend as much time as one can, practically speaking, doing those things which facilitate divine remembrance. One should not be out carousing, one should not be out drinking, one should not spend endless hours watching television. You know, one should not be at extremely rajasic environments where you can't think straight or have any peace. However, if you have to support your family and you have to commute to work, and if you perhaps have a job that isn't the most sattvic job, which isn't the most peace-producing job, then you have to still have to use that as an opportunity to experience the divine. So this is where the 8 manifestations of God, to me, bring this abstraction down to something extremely concrete and accessible. God manifests in 8 fundamental ways: love, joy, peace, calmness, light, sound, wisdom. I don't have to make sure that I said all 8, you get the point. In all circumstances, one or another of those 8 manifestations is going to be the appropriate aspect for you to tune into and to be a channel for. Sometimes we don't really love what we're doing. We have to do something that may be very challenging and very difficult. So love may not be what we're able to do. Let's say we're having to solve a very contentious situation where people are quite angry with each other, or maybe they're very angry at you. And so you can't just say, well, we're all children of God, we should all love each other. It's not going to bring about any result and is not the aspect of the divine that's being manifested. But you could be very, very calm. and calmness, as Master describes it here. He has beautiful explanations of what each of one of these bring. Let me just find the one on calmness. It's more dynamic than peace, and it has the calmness gives the devotee the power to overcome all obstacles in his life. He says, even in human affairs, the person who can remain calm under all circumstances is invincible. Isn't that a marvelous promise? Invincible. So we find ourselves in very contentious circumstances that we don't particularly love. Then we have to pick what's the right quality here. Calmness. That's what I really need. Or perhaps what we need in that moment is power. When Jesus was confronted with the money changers in the temple, it wasn't, again, a time to just go in and be so happy. Oh, my brothers, I'm so happy that you've turned my father's house into a house of commerce and that you are mistreating everyone and making a profit, in the temple of my Lord. Oh, isn't this wonderful? That was not what he needed to do. He came in with power. He came in with a whip in his hand. And even though their presence in that temple was a hallowed tradition for generations, Jesus literally alone knocked over their tables of commerce and drove them out of there. That was what was required, power. I'm sure Jesus was quite calm in the moment, and being a perfect master, he loved them. He was helping them overcome their ignorance. His power in that moment was an act of love. I was in a situation with a friend of mine in which the father of a woman, a friend of ours, who was dying of cancer, was so upset by his daughter dying that he was trying to keep all visitors out of the house. And we knew that his daughter would want to see us, and that the decision her father was making was not what our friend would make. Now, my inclination was to try to confront him. My wrong inclination was to think that the manifestation we needed was power. We just needed to push our way past him. Fortunately, I exercised another manifestation of the divine, which was wisdom. And I realized that I did not have the greatest wisdom in the group, and I deferred to my friend Paula in this case, who knew that the way to reach this man was with love. And when we went to the door to try to go in to see our friend, and he tried to order us to leave, she just radiated so much love to him and calmness, because she knew that he was just shattered by the impending death of his daughter. And what she gave him was just so much divine love that he melted in front of it and moved aside and let us come in. If I confronted him with power, I wouldn't have been acting as an instrument of God. I would have been manifesting my own ego in that moment. And always, in every circumstance, and that's how we make every experience of our life a divine experience. The 8 manifestations, I mean, if nothing else, make a list of them so you can always remember what they are. And when you find yourself in circumstances that on the face of it do not seem to be spiritual, then ask yourself, how can I be God's presence in these circumstances? And by pulling your energy in and disciplining the egoic tendency to fall into egoic habits, as my tendency was with that man, is that my egoic tendency was to put my power against his. That was not divinely inspired, but that was a divine opportunity that, by the grace of God and the wisdom of my friends, and a little bit of wisdom on my part, turned into a divine opportunity. It was an opportunity to love. So we will progress much, much more. Even Master's description here that I was reading out, that I find so beautiful, about what each of our human relationships can teach us. The one about children is also so sweet. Through people's children, God helps them to understand love as something precious, to be protected from harmful influences and nourished with devotion. Isn't that just an exquisite way to think about it? Here we are with our children, which is such an enormous preoccupation for most people in the world, something that they cannot not do. And also children can be for people just the most gripping of attachments. Think of the devastation that people go through if a child dies, the suffering that a parent goes through if the child becomes ill or unwell for any reason. But what we're trying to understand is the nature of love itself. You know, the child symbolizes that precious delicacy. And by pouring out the right care for that, what we're really nurturing is the divine child within us. Swami Kriyananda talks about this in terms of Christmas and the devotion that people who love Jesus have at Christmas time for the baby. And Swamiji talks about this in such a tender way, because a baby inspires in all of us this protective care. And that immediately just opens and expands the heart. We automatically want to protect and care for the baby. And Swamiji says, in some tiny corner of our mind, we also remember the Easter story, in which, you know, Jesus is crucified and resurrected, and the last thing he needs is our precious care. He's dying for our sins and giving us all salvation. But the baby is also true. And what the baby represents is, and as Master speaks of it often, the birth of Christ consciousness within us. And the way we protect the child and recognize its preciousness is the way we have to realize the divine child within us, or the beginning of the birth of that, the development. You know, it's like we begin to awaken. We're just like a baby being born. We begin to awaken spiritually. And that divine love growing within us is a child to be nourished and nurtured and protected from all harmful influences. We practice with our own children, and we can't help but think that our children are the point. But Master tells us that even our children are just teaching us something infinite, because those children are our children because they were birthed to our bodies, through our bodies. And when we're no longer living in this body, they no longer are our children. That doesn't mean that the soul friendship that brought you together in that form dissolves. No, that's eternal. And insofar as we are united in that way, we will meet each other again and again. But they're no longer your children. Swamiji has often, raised this as an example. If your baby dies and you're just utterly grief-stricken at the loss of your child, that same soul could be born next door, and you wouldn't have the same relationship to it at all. And you might not even notice. It's that it was mine. And so it's ephemeral by contrast to growing the child of divinity within us. And so we go from the baby Jesus to the Savior Jesus. And that's also, again, symbolic, you see, of what is possible for all of us if we put ourselves into this reality. And Master suggests that we love God as Mother, the compassionate Mother, and be, as he says, Mother's naughty child. He said when the baby cries, the mother tries to placate the baby with toys. But because the mother has other things to do, Master talks about the mother, Divine Mother's busy with her divine housekeeping. I mean, it's just a fanciful image. But he's trying to get us to see Mother is busy. If Mother is busy and the baby is crying, Mother will give the baby a toy because Mother has other things to do. But if the baby will not stop crying, the mother has to pick the baby up herself. And so in life, Divine Mother keeps dropping upon us the things. Will they be enough? Oh, here's my home, here's my babies, here's my husband, here's my wife, here's my success, here's my money. But Master says, do not be satisfied with the mere gifts that are enjoyable only as a tiny window into the real bliss that we can have. But he says no matter what she throws into the playpen of this world, keep wailing and keep calling her name until Divine Mother herself will take you in her lap and make you free. So, God bless you.